All right, what is up, everyone? I hope you're all having a great day today because we are about to dive into one of my favorite topics, and that is overrated comic book slash superhero movies. I feel like nowadays comic book movies tend to be overrated as hell. Constantly, every new movie that comes out is somehow the new best thing ever. And growing up with the MCU in its peak, dude, you heard that these movies were on the levels of some of the all time greats. And in this video, I want to list my personal top five. Now, just because a movie's on this list doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. I mean, I do think some of the movies on here are bad, but overrated doesn't necessarily mean bad. And if you guys disagree with me or agree with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. It helps a lot. All right, coming in at number one, and I'm going to be starting off with a hot take, is Thor Ragnarok. And I do think Thor Ragnarok is an enjoyable movie. I don't think it's a terrible movie, but I just think it's really overhyped for my personal taste. And a lot of this list is obviously going to come down to preference, but I think the reason that I don't really rate this as highly as some other people do is the stark change in character for Thor and Hulk. I like how, in the first Avengers and the first Thor movies and the original Hulk movie, they're really serious characters, which are more similar to the comics and the TV shows from back in the day. Thor is like the definition of what a god should be. He's intelligent, he's strong, he's moral, and he's serious. Similarly, the Hulk is an extremely serious character. He's a guy who struggles heavily with the circumstances of his condition, and in my opinion, he's probably one of the deepest characters in comics and film and media in general. So, with Ragnarok being as lighthearted as it was just a route that I didn't really like as much as other people did. I thought Thor and Hulk are way too silly for the majority of this movie. I thought the movie just lacked seriousness that I would prefer from these characters. I also thought Hela as a villain was pretty mid. Obviously, it's a great casting, and she could have been more interesting, in my opinion. But I don't know, it just wasn't there. We didn't spend enough time with her for me to be able to actually, bond with the character at all. She's kind of just a plot mover for Thor and Hulk, I guess. And I also hate this trope in movies where there's a villain for the entire movie and then all of a sudden, right at the end, there's a secret bigger villain for the main characters to take out, and he gets taken out in like the last 10 minutes of the movie, like really easily. And that obviously happens in Thor Ragnarok, and I just did not fuck with that at all. I think it's super lazy, and overall I feel like Marvel just really tried to dive into that goofy Marvel comedy that you see so much of nowadays with Marvel movies that kind of really made people not really fuck with Marvel anymore. I think that's one of the main reasons, and I think it started with Thor Ragnarok. And that's why I don't have it as, one of my favorite comic book movies. All right, coming in at number two is Superman 2025, directed and written by James Gunn. Now, I said before that I don't think all these movies are necessarily bad, but for Superman, this is not the case. I think this is genuine ass. One of the worst movies of the year, probably, for me, probably the worst movie of the year. And I think majority of the characters are just one-dimensional with little to no nuance. The plot feels extremely lazy, with its main goal being to just do the opposite of the Snyder movies, and not really trying to create its own identity at all. I think majority of the plot points are not explained well. Characters and their motivations are not explained. I'll give an example, like the engineer. I really don't know what her purpose was. I don't know what her motivation in this movie was. She's just like in debt to Lex, like loves Lex for some reason and wants to help him kill Superman. We have Other than that, we have no idea. And there's characters like that throughout the film. None of the Justice Gang really have any motivation. They're just kind of there. There's really nothing to go off, nothing to get you invested in these characters, in my opinion. And on top of that, I just think there's a ton of narrative inconsistencies. I think the movie was just so desperate to separate itself from the Snyderverse that it ended up just being like a sloppy, disjointed mess. It's one of those things that there's so much going on. There's Justice League level calamities, but somehow zero casualties. Tons of events in this movie would have legit caused major infrastructural damage and civilian deaths, but because James Gunn doesn't show any on screen, or coincidentally, magically, everyone escapes, fans are applauding it like he did something. Like, I just don't understand it. It feels like the movie was just like a Twitter thread written by Snyderverse haters. I thought the Kents are horrible. Martha and John Kent are terrible. They're basically just country bumpkin, low IQ morons who can barely string together a proper sentence. And don't get me started on the white supremacist Jor-El and Lara-El. It's just baffling shock value slop that really only serves to make Superman feel bad and make him seem more human because he disagrees with, his parents' hopes for him and Krypton. Yeah, and there's just a ton of bad, shitty dialogue and exposition. Like Superman's monologue with Lex at the end, having to explain to the audience how human he is, as if you don't already understand where they're going with it. The new punk rock scene just absolutely fucking cringe, man. And I could just go on all day about Superman 2025. And if you want a deeper dive, you could watch my review on Superman 2025 on my channel. All right, coming in at number three is another fan favorite, and I'm probably going to get some heat for this one too, but it's Captain America Civil War. Now, I do think Civil War is an okay movie. I don't think it's a great movie. I don't think it's a bad movie. But when it came out, everyone was talking about Civil War as if it was like the greatest shit since sliced bread, all time comic book superhero movie. And I really just didn't feel like it was on that level. I didn't feel like it was on the upper echelon of like the Sam Raimi trilogy with Spider-Man, or some of the older X-Men movies, or even like the newer X-Men movies like First Class and Days of Future Past. I don't think it's anywhere near that level of movie. And I'm not really a comic book reader too heavily, so there might be some things that are in the comics that are canon that I might just not like and I might not be familiar with. So don't bother going into the comics saying, "Oh, but that's comic accurate." I really don't give a fuck. Like, this is just my opinion on the movie. So for example, like Zemo, I think Zemo in Civil War is not compelling at all. I think he's mostly just like a plot device. He has little to no depth. His plan is pretty much solely reliant on plot conveniences and every character in the movie reacting exactly how he wants them to react. Otherwise, the entire plan falls apart. Like, if Captain America just tells Tony Stark the truth, the movie kind of just ends. Like, I feel like they would have just been able to find common ground and figure it out. So yeah, I just thought, and I also think just Captain America's decisions in this movie make no sense. As a guy who's supposed to be like a moral compass, it makes no sense to not tell Tony the truth and instead, cause a civil war to protect Bucky. I also think that Captain America's thought process in general, like with the Sokovia Accords, are just contradictory to the character itself. I find it odd that Captain America would be against the idea of holding superheroes accountable, considering he fought literal Nazis. You would think it'd be weird for him to believe the Avengers should be able to act with absolute authority and basically run their own authoritative regime. And yeah, with the amount of plot conveniences and just character contradictions, I just didn't rate it as highly as other people do. I still enjoyed the film. I still think it has great action. It has good moments. Tony versus Bucky and Cap is incredible. Like a great choreography. Great climax. But just overall, the rest of the movie didn't really do it for me. So many cameos. Although Spider-Man's cameo is amazing, that's like probably my favorite part of the movie is Spider-Man's cameo. That's when you really thought like, wow, dude, Tom Holland's actually gonna kill it as Spider-Man. I don't think he really has done that like in 2025 as yet, but that's just a different discussion overall. And yeah, that's about it for Civil War. Now, coming in at number four is none other than Spider-Man Homecoming. Now, Spider-Man Homecoming is a fine movie, but if you were there when it was released, almost all comic book fans were rating it extremely high, saying, it was the best Spider-Man movie. Tom is better than Tobey Maguire. Tom's Spider-Man is going to take over and lap the ones before him. And the thing is, Spider-Man is like the most popular comic book superhero ever. So he'll never not take over. It doesn't really matter who takes the throne, who takes over the role. It's always going to be the most popular superhero. So I find that to just be a weird statement, first and foremost. And Tom is a great actor and he definitely has the ability to be great as Spider-Man, but I feel like in terms of writing, he hasn't really been given the best from his directors and writers. I think as an actual film, most of his movies are pretty poor. Even No Way Home, I think could have made this list, but I decided not really to go with it because I genuinely really like that movie, even though there's a ton of things wrong with it. There's a ton of flaws. But anyway, I'm talking about Spider-Man Homecoming here. So, like I said, Homecoming is the definition of fucking mid. The character of Peter Parker in this movie does not really evoke that feeling of relatability or struggle as the Raimi trilogy did. Tom's Peter is basically an Iron Man prodigy. He's gifted, he's taken care of and almost babied by Tony Stark the whole film. It really feels like, the stakes are just at an all-time low for Peter. It doesn't really feel like there's any consequences to his actions. It doesn't feel like there's anything that can actually really go wrong. And I think that's kind of just a byproduct of the MCU in general, because most of the time, more of the compelling stories are saved for Avengers movies or other big IPs. So yeah, I really dislike that aspect of Spider-Man Homecoming. I don't like the fact that Peter's best friend is Ned. He's like a fat, dorky guy, and no Harry Osborn. I think that's a huge miss. Flash is a dork. Him bullying Peter makes absolutely no sense. He's supposed to be a jock, but he's just like this tiny little guy. And so I don't know. It's just goofy. I feel like some of these decisions, it was kind of more just like, it felt like a Disney original movie. It didn't feel like a real, like, larger than life Spider-Man movie, which is what it should feel like. And the Mary Jane retcon, I think, is just terrible. Michelle Jones is dumb as fuck. Zendaya is like the most overrated actress of all time, I think, in my opinion. And her performance as Michelle Jones is super flat. I didn't feel the chemistry between her and Tom at all while watching this movie. And it just wasn't there. It wasn't what it was cracked up to be. Obviously, Michael Keaton's Vulture was great, but that's just because he's such a good actor. I feel like you could give him anything and he'll probably make it work, and he did in this movie. But there just wasn't enough there for me to really fall in love with this movie as a lot of other people seem to have done. All right, last but certainly not least, I know I'm going to get absolutely crucified from people watching this video, but number five is The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight is probably my hottest take. I think The Dark Knight is extremely overrated. It's constantly seen as, like the best comic book movie or superhero movie of all time. People think it's Christopher Nolan's best work, and this is where I hard disagree. Now, of course, I really like The Dark Knight. I think the cast is insane, and there are tons of great performances, from Michael Caine, Aaron Eckhart, Gary Oldman, and of course, Heath Ledger as Joker. However, I really, and I mean really, really dislike Bale's Batman. I just personally think he never really fit the bill. He's solid as Bruce Wayne, don't get me wrong, but he was just never fit to be Batman, in my opinion. I was never sold on him being Batman because, Batman's supposed to be like an absolute powerhouse. And, I feel like Ben Affleck's Batman really got more of that than Bale's ever did. And don't get me started on the Bat voice, man. I don't know how many times I could hear, "Sway me." All I think about is, that old. I think people, if they're my age, they might remember it, but the old College Humor bits where it would be like the Batman and Superman, they were like totally taking the piss out of Bale's Batman. That's all I can think about. I could never take Bale's Batman seriously, and a lot of that is because of the voice. It is so bad. I genuinely have no idea why they let him rock with that for three movies. The fight scenes are pretty poor. If you rewatch these movies, they have not aged well. You're going to see some truly terrible choreography, and everyone just kind of feels like they're fighting in slow motion. Since there isn't really a ton of CGI and effects, it just looks clunky and like kind of disjointed. Rachel as a love interest sucked. Maggie Gyllenhaal was a terrible miscast in my opinion. I didn't feel her chemistry with Bale at all. I did not like the dynamic of her and Bruce in this movie. Plot wise, the movie's good, but nothing really spectacular in my opinion. I think it's kind of saved by brilliant individual performances, and maybe got a little bit overrated in light of, the tragic death of Heath Ledger. Now, that's not to say, those performances aren't that good. I do think Heath's performance was that good. But obviously, when there's a tragedy like that, his last work is obviously going to be a little bit overhyped. And that's just natural, right? Um, so yeah, that is really it for my overrated comic book movies. If you guys have anything to say about all of these, let me know in the comments. Please like, subscribe. Peace.